Hello, everyone. Welcome to Secura webinar. My name is Yulia Plivaka. I'm an account manager certification at Secura, and I will be a host for this webinar. Today, we will cover the topic of certification for IoT products. I would like to introduce our speakers for today, Anna Kurtovic, a security specialist at Secura, and Razvan Venter, group manager product security at Secura. The presentation will be followed by a Q&A session, so feel free to leave your questions in the comments, and we will address them at the end of the webinar. Anna, you're welcome to start the presentation.
Thank you for the introduction, Julia. Welcome everybody on behalf of me and Secura. Today we are going to talk about security threats for consumer IoT products, the relevant standards to evaluate consumer IoT security, and we're going to zoom into common criteria evaluations adapted for consumer IoT and an alternative certification scheme focused on ETSI EN 303645. We'll wrap up the session with conclusions and a session of question and answers from your side. So to begin, let's start talking about the rise of the IoT ecosystem. As we all know, the number and diversity and complexity of IoT devices has been ever growing, and there's an estimate of 27.1 billion IoT devices in this year, which is around 3.5 devices per person. And by 2030, it's an estimate of 125 billion connected devices per person. This is also going to result in a huge increase in the worth of this industry, raising from 424 billion from 2019, a figure that will rise or 1.8 trillion if in 2030. If you can see an overview of IoT devices that we mentioned here in this photo, we have split them into industrial and consumer devices, and in this session our focus will be on consumer IoT devices. This mainly consists of household items. The remaining consists of household devices that you can find in smart buildings, devices that are used in smaller business environments, and devices such as that are connected to the cloud. Yes, indeed, that's what I forgot to say. These devices are connected mostly to the cloud, and if we know what is the cloud in the bare essence of it, well, it's somebody else's computer. So you can imagine that there are quite some threats to this whole environment. And what are the threat vectors that we can encounter in these devices? So, for example, let's take a network IP camera or surveillance camera. This camera has some internal firmware. It consists of also maybe some internal storage that it has. It usually has a web app that mainly is not security focused, because this web app is most commonly a configuration management interface. Then it has a network recorder, an NVR, that is connected to it, that also has its internal firmware that it runs on. It has its storage to store the videos. It has also a web application usually, or an application where you can rewatch the stored videos, you can rewind them, make some settings. Sometimes it's also connected to somebody else's computer, and it has remote management and remote monitoring devices connecting via that cloud to see what footage is done. Of course, it's not only that, but these devices have to be physically stored somewhere. The camera is usually set up on a wall or an internal pole or outside of the buildings, and the NVR is also located in a room. So let's talk about what attacks can happen on the firmware. Was it modified before it was flashed onto the device? Are any updates or patch management? Are they cryptographically signed? Are there checks performed during the boot sequence of this firmware? In the hardware, are the debug ports disabled? Can we use a logic analyzer to extract data from the chips? In the communication, because there's a lot of communication between the elements of these systems. If the Bluetooth or Wi-Fi or NFC or Zigbee connectivity in the device, is it securely configured? For example, are secure pairing mechanisms in place? Is there transport encryption in place, or is the data sent unencrypted over an insecure channel? As we mentioned, most of these devices have small web app interfaces that usually serve as a configuration platform interface. Sometimes we find hard-coded passwords. Sometimes these web applications are not really focused on security. The login credentials, can they be brute forced? The software that is used to build the web app, is it outdated? Does it have publicly known vulnerabilities? Then we can talk about physical security of these devices. The operational environment, is it secure? Who can access these devices? Who can access, is there a lock on the door where the NVR is stored, for example? And in the end, we have logs and events. Is there an alarm if somebody tampers with the device, for example, sprays the camera? Is accountability ensured? So where do you start? If you're a developer or a vendor of such a device, where do you start? How do you know what type of security controls you should embed in your IoT device? Well, luckily, we have some guidelines for this. The responsibility for introducing these security controls is mostly lying within their developers, because they are the ones who have the power and who have the knowledge to place these security controls during the development phases of these devices. But which security controls to include? Well, today we have selected several standards, but we will mostly focus on common criteria and ETSI EN 303-645, because these two are appropriate for consumer IoT security devices. There's another standard, the EEC 62443 standard, but this one is more oriented to industrial security. It can be applied, but for today we have selected common criteria and ETSI standard. So let's start with common criteria. What is common criteria? Common criteria for information technology security evaluation is an international standard for computer security certification to certify different types of IT products. It assures that an IT security product has been specified and evaluated in a rigorous and repeatable manner at a level commensurate with the target environments for its use. So products can be evaluated by competent and independent laboratories. The certification can be issued by the certificate authorizing schemes. And the situation now is that the different countries has their own certification scheme. For example, in the Netherlands, this is the Netherlands scheme for certification in the area of IT security. And there are two main actors involved in this scheme, and this is the Netherlands National Communication Security Agency and TÜV Rijnland, Nederland, BV. In common criteria is not purely focused on consumer IoT. There are general types of, the focus is basically on three types of common IT products. And this is the general type of IT products, which is going to be the focus of today, because we're talking about implementations for consumer IoT, and smart cards and similar devices, and hardware devices with security boxes. So the certification process, the target of evaluation or your product, the developers of these products can make certain claims about the security attributes of them. Laboratories evaluate the products to determine if those products actually meet those claims. The evaluated products are examined to a level of detail specified by assurance, and certification bodies determine if the laboratories did a good job. That means that they sufficiently performed documental and technical assessment activities defined by the common criteria standard. And then in the end, the certificate issuer issues the certificate if all requirements are satisfied. Talking about assurance levels, in common criteria, the coverage and depth of the evaluation activities increases as the higher level of selected EAL gets. This means that at an EAL1 level evaluation, it will have the lowest associated volume and depth of evaluation activities. In an EAL1 evaluation, is basically the base level of common criteria evaluations. The level will contain minimal coverage. The higher the level, the more detailed and more depth of the evaluation goes. This means that the evaluation itself requires more time, it's more costly, it requires more detail and more documentation necessary, more extensive tests are performed. It also means that the product is less dependent on its operational environment and more robust against higher skilled threat agents. Higher levels of CC, for example, EAL5 and higher, are typically used by high-risk products, including ICs, smart cards, military-grade equipment, encryption devices, and similar. And if we're talking about consumer IoT, we can safely say that based on the operational environment, meaning a normal operational environment like a smart home or a business building and similar, commonly used devices, we are trying to protect those devices against threat actors that are not an organized hacker group, let's put it that way. So that falls between EAL1 and we can safely say EAL3, maximum EAL4. So where does it start? It all starts with a document called the security target. The creation of the security target is the responsibility of the sponsoring party who would like to certify the product. It might be the developer of the product or a third party. It might happen that the sponsor of the evaluation does not have the necessary expertise to create a security target, and in that case, you can ask for support of a laboratory or of a consultancy. So every IT product aimed at certification should claim a set of requirements that comply in the form of this document called the security target. And once this document is drafted, all other activities are based on this document. I'm going to spend some more time talking about the security target because it's a very important part of it. So let's take the previous example of our IP camera. So in the security target, there is something called the product overview, which is basically a description of the typical functionality and usage of the device. For example, the target of evaluation is a network camera, which comprises a hardware board that's a specific firmware for the hardware, etc., etc. So basically, it's this description of what your device does. It further contains something called the security problem definition. And in the security problem definition, you have descriptions of threats. For example, threat agents may try to modify the integrity of the video data sent to the recording device or NVR. The attacker can try to manipulate the data with a man-in-the-middle attack, and etc. You have the security policies that it should adhere to. For example, all passwords shall contain a minimum of 12 characters, and security assumptions about the operational environment. For example, attackers have no chance to connect any malicious device into the local network. This is saying that the device will be placed in a trusted network. And security objectives for the product. For example, the firmware image during firmware loading is verified by the target of evaluation in terms of integrity and authenticity. Now we're going to talk a bit more of language that is more common criteria. So you might notice that the language is switched a bit more formal. These are security functional requirements. For example, the TOW security functionality shall detect when an administrator configurable positive integer, meaning 5, you just choose a number, the TSF will detect when 5 unsuccessful authentication attempts occur related to administrators attempting to authenticate remotely. So your product will detect if somebody is trying to attempting to log in as an administrator for 5 times, and then it will, if the defined number of unsuccessful authentication attempts is met or surpassed, the TSF will terminate the session to the user trying to authenticate and block the user for a certain amount of time. Then security assurance requirements, meaning, for example, that the security target introduction shall contain the security reference, the target of evaluation reference. It will uniquely identify the target of evaluation. It will summarize the usage and major security features. The evaluator, then we have the evaluator action points that we will confirm that the information provided meets all requirements for content and presentation of evidence, and the reference, the overview, and the description of your product are consistent with each other. That the security target makes sense. Of course, these are just examples of items that we can find in a security target, but I'm just highlighting the most important parts. So, which security controls do you include? There are two ways to do this. You can refer to something called a protection profile. This is a document. It's basically a security target template that is designed by a community of users, usually, that came to agreement of minimum requirements of a type of device. For example, if you can see on the left-hand side, you can go to the Common Criteria portal and check if your type of device already has a defined protection profile. For example, if you're developing a storage devices, portable storage devices, on the left-hand side you can see an example. It says with which level of assurance is it set, and which country scheme is it under. Or if there is no security target for your type of device, you can use these different approaches. For example, you start with the environment of usage. Where is my device going to be used? Is it going to be used in a common household? What type of attackers we do not expect an organized group of hackers to attack a common household item. So who am I needing to protect my device from? Then you can derive security objectives from this and then select accordingly the requirements. Or you can start from a product approach. For example, what does your product do? I have a USB stick that cryptographically locks all the data, and if I have a PIN code on it, then the user with the correct PIN code can access the data. Well, it makes sense then in that case that the objective for that device would be to make certain that unauthenticated users cannot access that data. Then you can derive such security objectives and select the requirements accordingly. Once the security target is complete, I will shortly introduce how the rest of the procedure goes. In a very high-level overview, it goes through these three steps in the certification process. Preparation is a huge part of that, meaning preparing the security target, then set up a certification agreement and a kickoff meeting with the certifying body. The second phase is mainly the duty of the certification body and the laboratory, meaning that we evaluate and re-evaluate a lot of assets that have been provided by the developers. We do certification laboratories do evaluation activities, and then the certification body does their set. And make sure that the laboratory did the job well. For example, the security target evaluation is evaluated by the laboratory, and then proof of that has been presented to the certification body. Then the development documentation, meaning architectural descriptions of your target of evaluation, descriptions of security features, subsystems, and interfaces, guidance documentation consisting of user manuals and maybe setup manuals, for example, administration setup manuals if it's a client server kind of system that you want to certify. Lifecycle support, meaning versioning, updates, production procedures, change management, and similar. Then tests, if you say, there is on my web app there is a login scheme, then we developed tests will make sure that there is one, and we wrap it up with a vulnerability assessment. So all of these controls have to be checked by an independent vulnerability assessment. How do you prepare for a common criteria evaluation? You choose an evaluation assurance level. You make sure to have the required documentation. That is a very important step, and that speeds up the process a lot. And then decide whether you can create the security target yourself or choose to hire a consultancy. How to choose an EAL, how to choose an assurance level. Well, the value of the protected assets, the risks of the assets, again, who are your threat actors, the development, evaluation, and maintenance costs. These certifications can be quite costly, especially at a higher level, so you can also take into consideration your budget. Then your potential target market, who are your clients, and of course competitors research. What do other vendors that create similar or same products, what type of certificate do they have? Continuing to the market value and international recognition, so what are the benefits of getting certified? Common criteria is an internationally recognized standard. It has been derived from 4 standards that are in the market for 30 or more years, so it's very well known in the community. it has an improved security posture, especially during the vulnerability analysis. We often find security issues with the product that is then the security product posture of the product after such an evaluation is definitely improved. The validity of the issued certificate is 5 years, which is quite a lengthy period for such a certificate. You can have an advantage over direct competitors depending on the type of the target of evaluation. Direct competition with other companies could be an important aspect, especially for environments such as business or higher security environments, and acceptance of this CC certificate on an international level. Speaking of which, the technical basis for an international agreement, CCRA, this has for the mutual recognition of international certificates and recognition of certificates for the CCRA up to EAL2 for general types of IT products. In short, meaning that if you have up to EAL2, it will be internationally recognized by other national schemes as well. On the bright side, we will soon switch from national schemes to a common criteria EU level scheme, meaning that the certification will be harmonized for ICT digital products, and it will be in place in already the final version this year. And the first new evaluations under this scheme are expected in Q2 2022, meaning that the national schemes will be deprecated and it will be uniformed on the EU level. And from an evaluation perspective, not much will be changed for manufacturers. And as an extra benefit, the EU certificate will be recognized across the entire EU. Well, this has been, I hope you have gotten an idea of the scope and the procedures in the CC, in the common criteria evaluations. They can be quite lengthy and complex and deep, and require quite some dedication and time from both sides of the laboratories and the developers. There are also other standards that you can refer to, and my colleague Razvan will now present a second option of a standard that we chose for you today for IoT security. Razvan.
Thank you very much, Anna, for the first part of the presentation. Indeed, let's now focus our attention on an alternative that could be used actually, especially for the range of consumer IoT products, which will be in the scope of the ETSI EN 303645 standard. So first of all, let's discuss about the main need for the standard, the main reasons why the standard was drafted. The continuously increasing rhythm in which consumer IoT products are hitting the market is, of course, the main trigger behind the necessity of the standard. We already have in place certification schemes or programs for IT products, and common criteria was one example of them. However, there were concerns from the market, especially linked to the fast-paced environment in which consumer IoT products are coming. And this is especially linked to their continuous software update cycle, which is sometimes even limited to 1 month or less. So how well does something like common criteria scale to this story? And for this need, there was a clear request to create something simpler, something more of a baseline that could be used for the evaluation of such simpler consumer devices. The good news is that there was a specific task force within the European Union that has worked on this standard for the last couple of years. The history of the ETSI EN standard has started back in 2019, and actually even a bit before that, when the first draft of the standard was published in the format of a technical specification, the TS 103645, and then towards the middle of last year, in 2020, we had the first version of the ETSI EN 303645 standard. The idea of the standard, and also one of the biggest values linked to the standard, is the fact that, as the name says, it is an EN standard, European norm, European standard. And what that means is that as an European norm, it will carry the mandate to be implemented in all the countries members of the European Union. So then from an adoption perspective, from a market value perspective, obviously this standard will become one of the reference ones regarding cybersecurity and regarding consumer IoT security in general over the next years. The standard is split into several chapters which address the requirements for IoT products. And at a very high level, those requirements could be seen as split into technical requirements and process and procedural specific requirements. So let's try to quickly zoom in over those two categories and understand a bit better what we can find inside them. First, talking about the technical requirements, the product capability requirements, we have a couple of quite well-known security controls that are normally applicable when evaluating the cybersecurity of a product, and those are also mapped to the range of IoT devices. And some examples of such controls include password protection, so authentication of users, but also other devices, or for example, cloud services, which are connected to the target evaluation, but also security of the software updates to those products, the security of the stored or transferred data through the interfaces, validation of input data, and in general, minimizing attack surfaces, like for example, deactivating unnecessary ports or unnecessary components. That will be more from a technical perspective. But at the same time, as mentioned, one of the main reasons behind the establishment of the ETSI standard was to take into account also the process and procedural aspects behind consumer IoT products. Those type of products are normally in the center of a very fast-paced environment because they are connected both to the cloud, they're also connected to various mobile applications. So especially from a software update perspective, and let's say patch management, those items are happening very fast-paced. Sometimes, as we can also notice with our own home products, we can see software updates coming almost weekly, and most of the times at least once per month. So the biggest question is, how can a standard also take those kind of procedural aspects into account? And the good news is that the ETSI standard does take it into account. It has particular requirements dealing with security of the software update process, but also dealing with security incident and vulnerabilities management, which means that the manufacturer, the developer of IoT products, needs to take into account and have a well-implemented process based on which new incidents or new vulnerabilities are taken into account, they are analyzed, and relevant patches or software updates are further released to the products. Now, let's take a look at actually how would an evaluation based on the ETSI EN 303645 work, and compare it a bit with the previous part about common criteria. Actually, the main difference between them, to start with that, would be the fact that an evaluation based on ETSI EN 303645 should go as smooth as possible. One of the main reasons behind the creation of the standard was to create an alternative that would be much more cost-effective and effort-effective, both from the perspective of the evaluation lab as well as from the perspective of the developer. So a smooth process and easy to understand and easy to follow process is the key approach when testing based on the ETSI norm. The combination of testing includes both documentation review for some of the requirements, as well as a certain degree of testing and pen testing, as we will also see some examples in the next slides. To start with, documentation review, that actually should be one of the core aspects of an evaluation methodology based on the ETSI standard. Of course, testing and pen testing would play a role as well, as we will see later on. But from a documentation review perspective, it is quite essential that the developer is able to provide a third-party test lab sufficient documentation to demonstrate the way in which various security controls or security features are implemented into the product. That will definitely save time linked to testing, but also it will save time, particularly with respect to testing that otherwise will require quite expensive and sophisticated equipment and a large degree of effort associated, such as, for example, side channel equipment to understand the security of crypto features. If the developer is able to provide a complete key management documentation or a key table, and the evaluator is able to analyze those resources, then the need of expensive and long testing for validating the security of keys would be avoided, and we will end up with that smooth approach that we are talking about. That would be from a documentation review perspective. Then switching to testing and pen testing, well, of course, it is a technical standard, so a certain degree of testing cannot be avoided, and in fact, it's actually highly recommended when talking about consumer devices. So the evaluators will need to do at least some validation testing, in the sense that the claimed security controls, such as authentication, secure software updates, authorization, secure interfaces, will have to be validated, that those controls are actually in place. But also a certain, and here the accent, the focus needs to be again on a smooth and efficient approach of doing pen testing. which normally is tackled within a fixed time box, in which the evaluator is able to perform some focused pen testing, for example, on trying brute force attacks on passwords, for example, by trying fuzzing on interfaces or denial of service attacks on the product. That would be from a testing and evaluation perspective. Now, for the last part of the presentation, let's take a look at the way in which this ETSI standard is envisioned to be internationally recognized in the next coming period. And the good news to start with is that already we see more and more initiatives and more countries that are which are starting to focus their attention on this ETSI norm. It is definitely one of the hot standards that is being talked about in the last year or so, also if you take a look at relevant security conferences worldwide. The good news is that we have already a couple of ongoing initiatives, ongoing schemes, based on which developers of IoT, especially consumer IoT products, can get their devices certified. Some examples of those schemes are presented on this slide. We have an initiative ongoing in Finland for already about 2 years, driven by the Finnish cybersecurity agency, Traficom. Another one, which is particularly interesting, and I wanted to highlight, is coming from Singapore, so therefore outside the European Union, and is driven by the cybersecurity agency of Singapore, called Cybersecurity Labeling Scheme, which demonstrates that the ETSI standard has already broken the barriers of the European Union, and it's already seen as a relevant source outside Europe, in this case in Singapore. And finally, let's not forget about the private schemes that are starting to be established around this ETSI norm. And one example of such a private scheme is a scheme organized and driven by Bureau Veritas, based on which developers can again obtain certificate. So now let's take a look also at the future, especially in the perspective of the European Cybersecurity Act, another very important and hot topic nowadays, which also tackled in the previous part by Emma in relation with common criteria. The idea of Cybersecurity Act is to gradually replace the national initiatives of cybersecurity certification with EU-level certification through harmonized schemes. Of course, there are talks about a scheme on consumer IoT products or on IoT products in general. And the current discussions is that the ETSI norm, given its international recognition, especially at EU level, would represent the baseline or the main candidate for this upcoming scheme on IoT product certification. So therefore, being able to follow those requirements already and aligning the development practices in line with the standard would be a very good baseline for developers to start with. Finally, we have seen two approaches in this presentation for evaluating and certifying IoT products. We talked about common criteria or the ETSI standard, but then ultimately what to choose. What is the best option for you as a developer? So let's take a couple of last minutes on trying to summarize those findings. And on the slide, we see a summary between common criteria and the ETSI standard across several selected topics. So let's quickly go through them. From point of view of the assessment activities in both of them, of course, there's a difference. Common criteria is much more extensive. It will include, besides a documentation review on the development processes and design review, also testing and pen testing, but also very often site visits to evaluate and confirm the security of the development processes on site. While on the other hand, the ETSI standard is aimed to be more efficient. It is strongly focused on documentation review to avoid extensive and costly testing, and also takes into account a limited window of pen testing and validation testing. Talking about the effort, of course, common criteria has a very variable effort depending on the selected level, but for level 3 evaluation, developers will end up somewhere around 70% days, more or less, for a regular device, while on the other hand, the ETSI effort is estimated to be much lower, more in the range of 20, let's say 25% days for the whole standard. Talking about recognition, happily, both of them are very widely known. Of course, common criteria has been there for many years, so it is extremely well known across the whole world, not only in Europe, while the ETSI standard is a much newer initiative. But as we saw, it is already well recognized in Europe, but also outside Europe, with initiatives popping up, especially in Asia at this point. Talking about added value, common criteria is, you can see it as a very prestigious certification. It has been there for many decades already. People know about it, and whenever they hear about the existence of a common criteria certificate for a product, the level of interest and their recognition definitely gets higher. So from that point of view, it's very valuable for a developer. On the other hand, ETSI comes with the promise of being a much more efficient baseline with less effort for testing, a more efficient approach that will end up in quicker time to market and less budget to be invested by the developer in a certification itself. So from that point of view, of course, it comes with its own set of very important pluses for certification. Finally, to end with our recommendation, we would advise that for lower risk consumer devices, like the ones, for example, that we have in our own house, smart gadgets like appliances, TVs, smart speakers, and so on, developers are considering a more efficient baseline, such as the ETSI norm. While on the other hand, if we're talking about, let's say, enterprise IoT, which also takes into account products such as connected lights, smart elevators, alarm systems, or smart cameras, IP cameras, but obviously the risks are a bit higher because we're talking about an enterprise environment. For those kind of products, we will still advise developers to consider common criteria, especially on the lower EL levels, such as level 2 or level 3, which would be well suitable for those kind of products. With that, we have reached the end of our slides. Before we move to the questions and answer sessions, I would like to point your attention also to the upcoming SecurA webinars, especially in May. We have 2 webinars scheduled. First, on the 11th of May, we have a webinar focused on how to get the most out of your pen test. And furthermore, towards the end of the month, on the 27th of May, we have a webinar scheduled on medical devices, especially with a focus on regulations and practical approaches to demonstrate and implement medical device cybersecurity. Thank you very much for your attention in the last 40 minutes. And at this point, we are very open to take your questions.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Anna Razvan. I will give you some questions at the moment. Let me see. First question is, how are the updates addressed by these certification schemes?
Thank you. Maybe I can start with this one, Anna. Well, we have seen 2 examples of certification schemes in this presentation. One of them is focused on common criteria, and the other one focused on ETSI. To start with common criteria is a certification scheme that results in a single certificate linked to a single hardware version and software version of the product. Therefore, software updates and newer versions of the product are not covered by the existing certificate. They will have to go through, well, maybe small delta evaluation, but still they will have to go through another round of evaluation. On the other hand, the ETSI approach, well, it is also linked to a single version of the product from a software perspective. However, it takes into account the software development and release process. So from that point of view, whenever a developer has received a certificate for an initial software version, and they update that software version to, for example, release some new patches or bug fixes, as long as the software updates are falling under the same certified process for software updates, then certificate is still covering those new versions of software. And only the moment when the software itself is introducing new versions which have a security impact, then they will have to go through new evaluations. And that's why the ETSI standard is particularly valuable for fast-paced software updates environments.
Thank you, Razvan, for the answer. And the next question is, if our product doesn't pass the testing, does it mean that we don't get certified?
Maybe I can take this one, Razvan. So if during the penetration testing phase, the vulnerability analysis phase, the laboratory during the tests discovers a security issue where the security functionality that is claimed by the target of evaluation is broken, no, that does not mean that you lose your certification. It just means that we have to present that certain action as a fail, which is temporary, because then it is sent back to the developers that have then the chance to fix the vulnerability issues that were found during these testing. In the end, that is also one of the mentioned added benefits of the common criteria certification, for example, because in the end you will end up with a more secure product than you started. Then it's again presented, and again after the patches have been applied or after the issue has been fixed, it's reevaluated, and after that in the reevaluation phase you can get a pass on that certain aspect of security. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Anna. Next question is, certification is nice. Can you spare a few words on European legislation for the security of IoT devices?
Maybe again I can take this one, Anna. Yes, that's a very interesting topic, and of course the topic of certification and regulations very often go hand in hand. The existence of a regulation or a national law is almost every time the main trigger for a developer to consider certification, to consider investing their money, their budget, and their time into certification. Currently, at the European level, we have an ongoing initiative. Maybe some people have already heard about the RED, Radio Equipment Directive. The RED has been already in place in the European Union for some years. However, it didn't cover cybersecurity. Now, in the last couple of months, there is an ongoing initiative to integrate cybersecurity requirements under the RED directive. Therefore, all the devices, including consumer devices that embed any sort of radio functionality, like for example, a Wi-Fi chip or a Bluetooth chip, pretty much any kind of wireless communication, they will fall under the scope of this directive. And of course, since our consumer devices are mostly connected by wireless in most of the cases, then a big majority of them will fall under the scope of the RED directive. What that means is that in the next 1 or maximum 2 years, the RED will go live. So at that point, all the developers that want to sell such products in the countries of the European Union, they have to demonstrate that security was sufficiently taken into account. And this is where certification will play a massive role. And at this point, standards such as the ETSI norm are already recognized, let's say informally at this point. They're recognized as very good options to demonstrate compliance with the RED. So having such a certificate, such a proof that your product is compliant with the ETSI norm would be a very strong basis to demonstrate compliance with this upcoming regulation in particular.
Thank you, Razvan. And the next and last question for today is the firmware update not as OTA for many devices? What can be better solution for this as per certification?
I can try to give an answer. I think I understand the essence of the question. So the question is about software updates, and particularly with the focus on over-the-air software updates, on wireless software updates. So actually, it doesn't matter too much. Software updates are treated with the same kind of requirements, either if they are wired or over-the-air. OTA updates for consumer products, you have to still, based on the ETSI norm, you have to have your certified process for delivering software updates and delivering patches to your product. Of course, the moment when we're talking about over-the-air updates, then it gets particularly interesting from a cybersecurity perspective, because this wireless interface, either being Bluetooth or Wi-Fi or any other wireless protocol, could be more security vulnerable than a wired interface where the update simply goes by cable. And well, physically speaking, the avenues of attacks are a bit reduced. So if we're talking about over-the-air updates, then the security of those wireless interfaces will come into scope, and it will have to be tackled in the evaluation. And as long as those interfaces are secure enough and they implement protocols without publicly known vulnerabilities, then it is fine. And other than that, regarding the processes of software updates, there is no difference between over-the-air and wired updates, and both of those processes will have to be evaluated and certified.
Thank you, Razvan, and thank you, Anna, for a nice presentation and answering the questions. We will finish for today. Thanks everyone for joining. We very appreciate your time, and we would really appreciate if you can spend a few minutes to fill up our survey. You will get the link when you leave the webinar. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a nice day, and we will see you next time.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Goodbye.